Well, good morning, everyone. Before we get underway, there is just that one little bit of housekeeping. Could everyone make sure their mobile phone is turned off or on silent? Thank you. That's why we do this little bit of housekeeping. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here today. And if I could just start by saying a particular thanks to the Sydney Art Quartet, who have been performing as we've been gathering. The works we've been listening to were chosen as some of John Olsen's favourite music, performed by one of his most admired classical string quartets. To James Beck, the artistic director of the Sydney Art Quartet, James, I think you know, John loved your work and he would be over the moon to know that you and your fellow musicians are playing here today. So thank you to Tybalt Pavlik Hobber, to Anna Albert and to Andrew Jessic. We are looking forward to hearing from you later in the program. Ladies and gentlemen, today we acknowledge the traditional owners of the country we are on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. We extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be here today. My name is Michael Yabsley and I'm your Master of Ceremonies this morning. How fortunate am I to have been able to call John Olsen a friend. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here to honour the memory of Dr. John Olsen, AO OBE, a man of talent, of charisma, generosity and humility. He was a master of the brush, a truly great explorer and interpreter of everything from beloved massive Australian landscapes right through to the words, in the words of his friend Professor Ross Fitzgerald, the chaotic splendour of his own kitchen. Through his ingenuity, his landscapes became our landscape. His kitchen became our kitchen. This state memorial is to pay tribute to John's unique talent, his unyielding passion for the arts, and the great legacy that he leaves. Part of that legacy is the untold joy that he brought to so many people. As well as being the globally acclaimed painter, he was the gregarious raconteur. He was the thespian. He was the poet, the bon vivant, the cook, the philanthropist, the teacher, the mentor, the student of literature, and yes, the businessman. Although I'm not sure that Louise and Tim are quite as on board about the idea of the business credentials. But the great man would say, the only embellishment to an outstanding piece of art should be a red dot. He said, I love red dots, with that cheeky smile on his face. The Olsen smile was a manifestation of someone who had charisma, and John Olsen had it by the truckload. When it came to lighting up a room, he was in a class of his own. Remarkably, in the twilight of his life, John was still in the prime of his life. The solitude of his studio was far from the full story. He loved an audience, and pressing the flesh for John Olsen was intuitive. The Olsen family is uplifted to see so many of you here today to celebrate the life of one of Australia's greatest artists, someone who has a place on the world stage of contemporary art. But while the world celebrates a long and famous life, a family mourns the loss of a father and grandfather. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to get the proceedings underway by acknowledging some of the distinguished guests who are here today. Of course, members of the Olsen family, who we will acknowledge individually during today's service. Colonel John Hutchinson, representing the Governor-General of Australia. Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley, Governor of New South Wales. The Honourable Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister of Australia. The Honourable Chris Minns, Premier of New South Wales, and Mrs Anna Minns. Senator Andrew Bragg, representing the Leader of the Federal Opposition. The Honourable Kevin Anderson, representing the Leader of the State Opposition. The Most Reverend Kanishka Raphael, Anglican Archbishop of Sydney. The Honourable Ben Franklin, President of the Legislative Council of New South Wales. State and federal parliamentarians, both past and present, and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, both in attendance here today and everyone joining us online, whether you be in Australia or from anywhere around the world. How appropriate that today's state memorial service is being held in this spectacular venue, the Art Gallery of New South Wales. This building, these two buildings, are places that salute both tradition and change, symbolised in the two totemic buildings that stand side by side, so different in design, but unified in purpose. John had many connections to the gallery, and so it's fitting that we gather here to honour his life. We thank the gallery, the trustees and the staff for so generously hosting us here today. Thank you to the Commonwealth and New South Wales governments. Jointly, you, Prime Minister and Premier, have made this remarkable celebration of John Olsen's life possible. John's family, friends and the artistic world are deeply grateful. Barry Humphries made it clear that if John predeceased him, that he, Barry, would like to eulogise him. As the cards fell, sadly, suddenly and surreptitiously, neither John nor Barry got to eulogise the other. But each one did have a lot to say about the other while they were with us. These two cultural giants, best friends, both thespians, one from the visual arts, the other from the performing arts, they left us roughly at the same time, just recently. And life will never be quite the same again for those who knew them and the millions who knew about them. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to introduce Mr. William Barton. And William, if I could invite you to the stage to join us. William is going to share with us his piece, Spirit of the Landscape. William is a composer, producer, multi-instrumentalist and a vocalist, and is widely recognised as one of Australia's leading yardaki players. And William, you're also a great friend of the visual arts community. Please welcome William Barton.
Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge the Olsen family and the traditional custodians of the land that we walk upon. Thank you for painting our dreaming stories of thousands of years old. Now Uncle John is up there painting that big Dreamtime story too, with those elders of our landscape in our mother country. His paintbrush was his message stick, his connection to his songlines of his people, but also to ours. And may we share in the legacy and spirit of Uncle John Olsen in the spirit of the landscape. Whoa!
Well, to William Martin, a big round of applause. Thank you, William. Ladies and gentlemen, our first tribute will be from Lou Klepak. Lou is an art historian and a publisher. He first met John Olsen in Perth back in 1978 at the opening of the exhibition Contemporary Australian Drawings. Lou had the job of arranging, as Deputy Director of the Art Gallery of Western Australia, as he was in those days, that exhibition. It was then, all those years ago, that John asked Lou to write the introduction to the book that he was writing, My Complete Graphics. They remain friends for the rest of John's life, with many recent conversations about art and literature taking place where? Where else but Lucio's at Paddington. And can I just say that Lucio and Sally are here in the audience today. It's wonderful to see you, Lucio. Your wonderful restaurant was one of John's happy places. And as you know, we miss you from the Sydney landscape. Sydney misses you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Mr. Lou Klepak.
when a great footballer dies, we bury him, and then we erect a statue of him outside the stadium to remind us of the great feats that he performed as a footballer. But when a great artist dies, it's different. We bury only the man, the father, the grandfather, the friend. The artist remains with us in the works he created. They are his vision and his legacy. John Olsen was part of a gifted group of painters, all born in 1927 or 28, which includes Fred Williams, Charles Blackman, Lawrence Dawes, and Leonard French. They were the second wave of the great flowering of Australian art that occurred in the second part of the 20th century. They were the successors of Drysdale, Nolan, and Boyd. What is special and what distinguishes Olsen from his contemporaries are two things. Firstly, he was devoted to books and literature, especially poetry, which extended his terms of reference beyond the materials of art and the studio. This knowledge gave him a voice. And second, he was not intimidated by the scale of paintings. Who among his contemporaries was able or did work on such a large scale? I'm not just referring to the Opera House mural, but to the works that he began to paint after his return from Spain. Works so full of confidence that made James Gleeson, the director of the Dobell Foundation, decide that it was Olsen to whom the Opera House commission should be given. The 1960 painting Spanish Encounter, which is hanging outside, that explosion of creative energy should always be on view. It is a talisman for much that came after, and not only from Olsen's brush. It was like Moses striking the rock and outpoured Olsen's first great series of Australian landscapes, works full of joy. It was a great period for art. We had some exceptional painters, but not yet a fitting audience for their achievement. For several decades, contemporary Australian art flourished with a small elite following. Olsen was lucky that the foundations of his life's work took place at a more innocent and conducive period of our history. When I said that Olsen had a voice, I meant that he did not just paint. Olsen was a great reader, and he had an active mind. He reflected and considered, and he deposited his thoughts and ideas into his many journals. These he presented to the National Library, and they are now being prepared for publication. In them, you will find his voice. During his long and prolific career, Olsen taught us to see and understand our continent and its landscape with new eyes, its heroic dimensions, its incredible variety and beauty. And he scrutinized it like an eagle from above. I have followed Olsen's career from the privileged position of a friend. I have seen all the important exhibitions of his work, but it was the last, very recent one, organized by the National Art School, that had the greatest impact on me for the intensity of the vision it presented. I told him that I considered it the alpha and omega of the art of painting. There was no floss, just the essence of painting, and it revealed him to be a great artist. And what a moving tribute this exhibition was to the 93-year-old artist who had painted these remarkable works. He was able to look back at what he had created and the legacy he was leaving behind. Such exhibitions are usually arranged after the artist is no longer with us. So thank you to the National Art School. John, who loved poetry and poets, would approve of the following concept attributed to W.H. Auden. We are guests of existence which must be honored with delight. I think that John Olsen, during his long creative life, did exactly that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lou, for those beautiful words. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now with great pleasure I introduce Louise Olsen, John's daughter, to share with us some cherished family memories. To Louise, who's coming up on the stage now, and Tim, only you will know the joy John and your mother Valerie got from your own lives and your own careers. Through Dinosaur Designs, Louise, and the Olsen Gallery in Wallara, Tim, you have both taken your own celebrated places in the creative world. That's the creative world personified by your parents. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Louise Olsen.
John was an artist. He was a writer, a teacher, and a poet. But to us, he was Dad. We grew up at Watson's Bay in a weatherboard cottage. We'd find Dad at around 5 or 6 in the morning at the kitchen table. He'd be with a cup of tea, reading poetry. One of his favourites was Dylan Thomas and Keats. There was always a sketchbook at hand, thoughts and doodles alongside. And he was always there, thinking and writing and pondering. Mum painted in the front room, Dad in the lounge room. The smell of turpentine embedded the floorboards. Dad would take us for a swim in the morning, one of us hoisted up on his shoulders, and we'd walk down to Camp Cove Beach. We'd head down to the rock pools and we'd look at sea urchins and pipi shells and oysters. He would point out to us the shapes and the forms and the depths and the layers of the rock pools. We'd walk back up the hill and he'd talk to us about the universe. He'd point out the birds and he'd get us to identify the seagulls, the cormorants and the pelicans. Many of you know my dad for his frogs, but he also loved birds. In the evening, Dad would read us Magic Pudding, which was one of our favourites. He'd turn verse into song and he'd play out each character. Cooking was always at the heart of the family, a role Dad always relished. On lean times, there was cheese, olives and bread, and when Dad sold a painting, it was always champagne and paella. In the early 80s, we moved to Dural, which was quite remote back then. I remember Dad picking us up from the school bus with batik pants on and a bright shirt and a beanie. Despite my teenage embarrassment, I was always proud that he was not like the other fathers. Our house was built of mud bricks, clay walls and bamboo ceilings, and my parents' work hung on the walls alongside Clifton Pugh and Fred Williams, Donald Friend and Margaret Preston. There was also objects from Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal artefacts. When I brought friends home, they always looked at everything like they were in a strange gallery or museum. Dad was always fond of a line. One of his favourites was, "Everything is okay when the soul is at play." And Dad was, if not nothing but playful. Another one that Dad loved, which was borrowed from Paul Klee, which he used to describe painting, which was taking the line for a walk. For Dad, this is where the magic happened. This is where the imagination took off. He never took it for granted. He said, "You've got to create like a god, command like a king, and work like a slave." Another one he liked was, "Great art makes you feel free and full of possibilities." And he would say, "I like paintings that are as light as a whisper and as fragile as the evening breeze." I'd often pop into his studio around lunchtime, or before lunchtime actually, and would find him with a glass of wine. And he'd say, better 1 at 11 than 11 at 1, quickly followed by everything in moderation, including moderation. He delighted in finding something new. He was always curious. One of his passions was haikus, because he loved the way haikus related to nature. One of his favourites was basho. Old pond, frog leaps in, sound of water. Dad was painting right to the end. Passion and urgency were his life force. There was always something he wanted to share in a way he knew best, by making a mark on a canvas. He created whole worlds. In the 80s, he visited Lake Hindmarsh, and he was entranced by the birds that flew across the landscape, something he described as empty and full. He said to me later, if you're ever looking for me, I'm the little bird in the landscape, flying across the wide open spaces. And that is how I'll always remember him.
Thank you, Louise. Beautiful words, absolutely beautiful. And we now have a new compass in life, everything in moderation, including moderation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm now delighted to introduce to you for the next musical performance, Jim Mogini from Midnight Oil and Bertie Blackman, daughter of the late artist Charles Blackman, a lifelong friend of John Olsen. The first song, Sitting Pretty, was written by Charles' other daughter, Christabel Blackman, and Jim Mogini, and is about Christabel sitting for her portrait as a child. The second song, Dark Days, was written by Bertie for her father, Charles. This is a very special musical interlude, and we're delighted to welcome you to the stage. Thank you, Jim.
She's feeling up inside into places of composure, ready to be still and abide. And placed upon our wicker chair, cushioned into quiet, and playfully arranging her hair, braid to golden silent, silent. Ooh, and painted with his brush, the picture tells a tale, but she's composed and sitting pretty, and she's composed and sitting pretty, and she's composed and sitting pretty. like a pin, cool to the ground. And now I'm wondering if I'll ever get to wake in the sun. Oh, when is it a sign? Because I'm waiting for someone on you, and you. In another time, another place, away from this thing we're starting. In another year, another space, safe from worlds colliding. Ooh, 'cause everywhere I see your face, memories of us are hiding under long nights. Ooh, ooh, under dark days. Ooh, there was a time I could control it all when you were around. How could I have known? Ooh, feeling so haunted. Now I've forgotten every other thing I've learned in this town. Ooh, but I can't let go, because I'm dreaming of something new. Ooh, something new. In another time, another place, away from this thing we started. In another year, another space, safe from worlds colliding. 'Cause everywhere I see your face, memories of us are hiding under long nights. Ooh, ooh, on the
Thank you very much, Jim Ogini from Midnight Oil and Bertie Blackman. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now with great pleasure I introduce Tim Olsen. Tim, in your best-selling memoir, Son of the Brush, you talk about your earliest memories, many of them shared with Louise, about your father's studio in Watson's Bay. You talk about the vast canvases, the smell of that turpentine, gum turpentine, scraped pallets, oil-stained rags, and the occasional unfinished glass of red above the fireplace. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Tim Olsen as he joins with Louise in sharing with us the life and times of John Olsen.
Louise, you've taken so many words out of my heart about how we felt about Dad and how absolutely proud that he lived in a country that would honour an artist the way it is today. I thank the Prime Minister, the Premier, Her Excellency, Governor-General of New South Wales, Colonel Hutchinson. I thank Michael Brand, the Director of the Gallery, for making the gallery available. I want to thank Kylie Norton's John's biographer, who's done so much to make today perfect. My personal assistant and director, Katrina Arendt. It is such a team effort for a day like today to happen. And John, well, as they say, a man or a woman can be measured by their life, but certainly a memorial and a goodbye can also be an indication of a life well lived. My father did live a great life. He absolutely used every moment of it to observe this country. He loved this country more than anything. He had the opportunity to be an international exhibiting artist. But, you know, he didn't care about the big money that could be made. He cared about his responsibility to this country and to make sure that Australia knew how to love it. And as today more than ever, we understand that, as he would always quote Auden, in regard to the role of the artist, in the prison of our days, it is to teach the blind person how to praise. Dad was a landscape poet to the end, maybe a silent musician. He didn't use words or letters. He had his own vocabulary, his own, in a sense, his own marks, his own aesthetic in regard to what made up what Australia is. He had great respect for our First Nation artists because they knew 60,000 years ago and how things have developed today that Australia cannot be encompassed by a foreground, midground and background. He knew, as did our First Nation artists, that it is to get above the landscape do we encompass and we're able to appreciate and fathom the great vastness that this country offers, the tonalities, the meandering sensual rhythms of rivers, and the deeper essence. When we travel internationally and people ask us, what is the true Australia? It's not Bondi. It's not necessarily the beach where most of our non-Indigenous populations live. Why is it that we end up in the desert when most of us don't live there? It has a silent spirit, a quiet calling that tells us that's where our heart is. My father knew that so well. He understood the rhythms of the landscape, and often he was asked, and actually in one situation, he was asked by a European artist, Australia has such a different look about it. It's not green and it's not soft. Olsen, in one word, how would you describe the rhythms of this country? And he looked at this man and he said, like the hind leg of a dingo. He grew up in Newcastle in a house that had no books and no art. Quite extraordinary. He moved to Bondi and went to Bondi Public, a school that he really had no idea that he was sharing the alumni with people like the great musician Don Burrows, Margaret Whitlam, and the great footballer Ken Arthurson. What a classroom. What a diversity of vocations they all ended up in. I don't know who their teacher was, but he certainly knew how to point them in the right direction. John then went on to St Joseph's College, where he wasn't particularly born a Marist, but he was good at football, and that's what his father thought was best for him. He was caned 24 times for being caught in the Lazy Susan between the dining room and the kitchen, with the pad covered in women's breasts. He certainly was a naughty boy. But he was also unknown, which a lot of people don't know, that he was also New South Wales backstroke champion. So he really was a Renaissance man in every way. But his parents never, ever did anything but try to give him the best start in life. And when he left school, he worked in a bank. And after 6 months, he went home and confessed that during his lunchtime, he went down to the Julian Ashton Art School and did a drawing class and realised that the bank wasn't for him. His father turned to him and said, "John," and this was the days of when, you know, basically the Australian diet was meat and 3 veg. It was a very black and white country in those days. But my grandfather said to him, "John, I've got 3 issues with this." John turned to him and said, "What's that, Dad?" He said, "Firstly, you'll never make any money. Secondly, there's a lot of strange sexual orientations in art schools. And thirdly, how are we going to explain this to the neighbours?" He was a very humorous man, my father. And I think when I spoke to him recently, he best described how he was a person who really loved the aesthetics of everything. And as we know, as Lucio would know and Sally, that cuisine was one of the things that certainly directed his appetite towards everything. A lot of his art is very appetising. But I popped the question to him. I said, and this is some time ago, I said, "Dad, what frightens you most? Or are you frightened of death?" He said, "Oh, yes." I said, "But why? You've lived such an incredible life." He said, "Oh, I'm terrified of death. Don't worry about that." I said, "But why?" And he turned to me and he said, "What am I going to eat?" But, you know, having parents like ours, it was like living in an early modernist still life. The kitchen was there, and often there was a fresh fish straight from the pub, where he'd often meet the fishermen in Watson's Bay in those early days, which really was our kind of under Milkwood. The table was always full of opinionated thinkers, and ideas were uttered like prophecies, raging from arguments, and advice thrown around like sea salt, with dancing, music, laughter, and sometimes tears. Dad was a very cunning man. He was often the puppet master. He could control the table of guests. And in his own way, and cheekily, he would either have everybody in hysterics or crying with laughter, or ending having had a huge disagreement about something to do with the opinion of art. But all in all, nothing was ever boring. I think one of the things that most touched me about my father was the fact is that despite the fact that often he had to put art first, he still loved us enormously. And he's given us a life and an insight into a different kind of world that we could live in. And certainly Louise and I, through the choices that we've made in regard to our careers, we want to keep that vision and that dream alive. That, as Auden said, it is, especially in times like today, in such a difficult world, that we have to take refuge in beauty. The thing about my father was that he often was unable to win over people in regard to what his art was all about. But there was a way by which he was able to make people really understand what it is, and that he was never after reality. He was never out to be a representational artist. He did all that before the age of 12, very much like Picasso. To him, memory was more important, that memory is the powerful thing. When we look back on our lives and we want to think about why life is worth living, it is memory that keeps us there. He was able to bring the landscape into the studio, and as Louise said, he would go in and take the line for a walk. But the important thing about it all is that he only ever was concerned about what he could do in the studio that day. He was very much never concerned about his audience or money. He went in there out of passion every day to create. He was a true artist. We have not lost his soul. We have not lost him. He will still live on, and he will always live on through every drawing and every painting he ever created. I want to finish just by quoting Bessie Stanley, the great American poet. He has achieved success who has lived well, laughed often and loved much, who has the respect of intelligent men and the love of little children, who has filled his niche and accomplished his task, who has left the world better than he found it, whether by an improvised poppy or improved poppy, a perfect poem, a work of art or a rescued soul, who never lacked appreciation of earth's beauty or failed to express it, who always looked for the best in others and given the best he had, whose life was an inspiration, whose memory is a benediction. That was my father.
Thank you, Tim Olsen, son of the brush. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we move to a special performance by Amy Skinner, who will be accompanied by the Sydney Art Quartet, who are taking their place on the stage right now. Amy is an acclaimed opera singer who has performed solos locally and internationally. She also plays a key role at the National Art School and was involved in John's last major exhibition, Goya's Dog, which Lou has told us about. As Amy knows so well, from working alongside Stephen Alderton, the National Art School director, John Olsen loved the National Art School passionately. The school has just celebrated 100 years of occupancy at the old jail in Darlinghurst. It was part of his life. He studied there, he taught there, he supported the place, and when necessary, marched in the streets to defend the National Art School and its unique, independent, studio-based teaching model. Tim and Louise record in the foreword to the book A Rare Sensibility, a book about the art of their mother, Valerie Strong. They write, "It was at the National Art School where Mum fell in love with our father, then her teacher." With John's passing, the National Art School has lost a staunch advocate. John Olsen has also passed the baton to others to be guardians of the visual arts. And so, Prime Minister and Premier, I hope you won't mind me saying, when this generation of advocates of the visual arts are on your doorstep, they are standing on the shoulders of John Olsen, Margaret Olley, Norman Lindsay, Albert Namatjira, Frederick McCubbin, Fred Williams, Sidney Nolan, the list goes on. Charles Blackman, who we've mentioned. Think of the likes of Geoffrey Coburn, Geoffrey Smart, of John Coburn, Geoffrey Smart, Brett Whiteley and Grace Cossington-Smith, and many others, including the great artists who are in this room today. paying tribute to the life and times of John Olsen. The Quilties, the Storiers, they will be there. Ladies and gentlemen, today Amy will be performing an arrangement of Solo Conti, a piece originally attributed to Handel. The lyrics translate to say, "Just with you I will find joy in my heart. With you I will reach heaven. There will be peace. With you I will see a new world." Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome this magnificent singer to the stage, Amy Skinner, to perform with the Sydney Art Quartet. Thanks, Amy. Thank you to Amy Skinner and the Art Quartet. That was beautiful, Amy. Thank you. It's now with great pleasure that I introduce the Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Anthony Albanese. Prime Minister, thank you for being here today. You dignify this occasion not only with the office that you represent, but perhaps even more so by being the person you are. It's with great pleasure I invite the Prime Minister of Australia to the stage to pay tribute to John's contribution to the Australian nation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Anthony Albanese.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I note from Louisa's comments, great art makes you feel full of possibilities. We're going to give Australians a possibility to change the country for the better in the last quarter by voting yes in the referendum that will be coming up. Of all the gifts that John Olsen gave us, the greatest was perhaps persuading us to see Australia with fresh eyes, to behold this landscape in all of its familiarity and extraordinary antiquity, and to see it in a new light. John summed it up himself in 2016, at the opening of a retrospective on a career that for most of us was already in its maturity by the time we were born. And I quote, "We've got the richness of emptiness, which for some reason was known as the dead heart. That's a lie. That's not true. It's teeming with life, and this kind of thing is an exciting thing. To be an Australian artist is to be an explorer." Carrying with him the echoes of this continent's millennia of art, John in his mind's eye explored from the air. But even from the greatest altitudes, he could still peer below the surface and find the truth that lay beneath the literal. He lifted himself even higher and delved even deeper. An explorer whose maps were traced with music and philosophy and poetry. And what a wonderful send-off today is. And this, all of this, just kept feeding John's inner richness to the point where it overflowed, pouring through his fingertips and the brush that was, in itself, such a perfect, intimate extension of the man. By the time he was done, that once blank stretch of canvas burst with life and emotion. The familiar exploded and reassembled into something remarkable in its newness. He created art during the highs. If someone knew how to ride the crests of life's happiness, it was indeed John Olsen. And then, during those periods when the light grew dimmer, he still went in search of his spark. What also shone brightly with him was his mentorship of young artists. With a generosity that was every bit as bountiful as his charisma, John set about building a future that would extend far beyond even his long and remarkable life. A future for Australian art through the young artists striving to find their way. The education John gave went far beyond the intricacies of technique, helping them build a cultural hinterland for themselves. John understood that art is never just a picture and that it needs rich soil to feed its roots, and how he kept replenishing it, like a grand old tree rising above the forest canopy, bestowing its leaves on the earth below in a never-ending cascade of colour. Now the tree has fallen. John Olsen leaves the space, but true to form, he saw to it that it would be filled with colour and a light as bright as that twinkle in his eye. We mourn an extraordinary Australian today, an Australian who has lifted up our nation, this poet of the brush. But more than anything, we celebrate him and we hold on to the gift that he gave us. May John Olsen rest in peace.
Thank you, Prime Minister, and again to the Prime Minister and Premier, thank you for being here today and thank you for making this state memorial service possible. Now, we'd like to go to an interlude of photographic memories, a photo montage accompanied by music performed by the Sydney Art Quartet, who are still on the stage, and they feature some of John's favourite works. But ladies and gentlemen, as we watch and listen, spare a thought for those closest to John when they were presented with the fait accompli at the end of last year, just before Christmas, that the 94-year-old was off to Central Australia. The flights were booked, the accommodation was organised, nothing could stand in the way of his spending time in another of his happy places, Central Australia. Nothing could stop the frail but determined nonagenarian going to his beloved Central Australia. You see, we hear a lot about the places where John Olsen was at home, but nowhere was he more at home than in Central Australia, perhaps with the exception of Beppy's, and his beloved home in the Southern Highlands. Well, I can almost hear Tim and Louise saying about the trip to Central Australia, what could possibly go wrong? Well, surprise, surprise, things did not go according to plan. Upon arrival, John was admitted to Alice Springs Hospital, where he was asked the question I'm sure we're all familiar with these days. Mr. Olsen, do you have any allergies? The reply from the ailing and somewhat, by this stage, grumpy traveller was, my only allergy is to bad art. So let's take these wonderful images as they come up on the screens in front and around the room. Let's take them in and listen to the beautiful music performed by the Sydney Art Quartet. Thank you. Thank you again to the Sydney Art Quartet, and thank you to the Olsen family for sharing those beautiful images from the inner sanctum of the luminous records, but they really are very, very special. Ladies and gentlemen, talking about the Olsen family, it's now with great pleasure that I invite Georgina Blake, Camille Olsen Ormady, and James Olsen to the stage. Please come up and join us. From the younger members of the Olsen family tree, we're going to hear from Georgia Blake first, with a reading of 5 Bells by Kenneth Slessor. Please welcome Georgia to the microphone.
I am the eldest granddaughter, daughter of Jane, and Aditi is John's great-granddaughter. Grandpère was like the moon, controlling gravity, pulling you in. He had a poetic spirit, and this poem meant a lot to him. Bear with me. Time that is moved by little fidget wheels is not my time, the flood that does not flow, between the double and the single bell of a ship's hour, between a round of bells from the dark warship riding there below. I had lived many lives, and this life of Joe, long dead, who lives between 5 bells.
5 bells.
Deep and dissolving verticals of light ferry the falls of moonshine down. 5 bells coldly rung out in a machine's voice. Night and water rip to one rip of darkness. The harbour floats in the air. The cross hangs upside down in the water. Why do I think of you, dead man? Why thieve these profitless lodgings from the flukes of thought anchored in time? You have gone from earth, gone from even the meaning of a name, yet something's there. Yet something forms its lips and hits and cries against the ports of space, beating their sides to make its fury heard. Are you shouting at me, dead man? Squeezing your face in agonies of speech on speechless pains? Cry louder, beat the windows, bawl your name. But I hear nothing, nothing. Only bells, 5 bells, the bumpkin calculus of time. Your echoes die, your voice is doused by life. There's not a mouth can fly the pygmy straight. Nothing except the memory of some bones long shoved away and sucked away in mud, and unimportant things you might have done, or once I thought you did. But you forgot, and all have now forgotten. Looks and words and slops of beer, your coat with buttons off, your gaunt chin and pricked eye, and raging tales of Irish kings and English perfidy, and dirtier perfidy of publicans, groaning to God from Darlinghurst. 5 bells.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the lectern Camille Olsen Ormady for a reading Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dixon.
Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labour and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed a school where children strove at recess, in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer, my gown, my tippet, only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. And if I could say one thing as well, something that I said in our funeral a couple of weeks ago. I was honoured to be a part of my grandfather's kitchen table art school down in Barrel. And it's a memory that I will never forget. A final student, a part of his world, his life as a teacher that I will never forget, and that will live on through our whole family. The life force of art lives through all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Camille. And now finally from James Olsen, another grandchild of John's, Poem in October by Dylan Thomas. Thank you, James.
Before I read this short snippet, this is one of Papa's favourite poems, Poem in October. I'd like to also honour his love of literature. As I mentioned in the state funeral, he loved Shakespeare. And as said in Hamlet, he was a figure of infinite jest, and I'll always miss him. A spring full of larks in a rolling cloud, and the roadside bushes brimming with whistling blackbirds, and the sun of October, summery on the hill's shoulder. Here were fond climates and sweet singers, suddenly come in the morning, where I wandered and listened to the rain-ringing wind blow cold, in the wood, far away under me. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for John Olsen's grandchildren, for Georgina, Camille, for Georgia, Camille and James. Thank you for those beautiful readings. I think we can say the Olsen dynasty and legacy is in the very best of hands. Ladies and gentlemen, we now have a compilation of footage kindly made available to us by the ABC, some of which has never been publicly screened. It gives us a glimpse into John Olsen and his connection to our national identity. John's studio was often a place of fun, where solitude would, in the words of Ross Fitzgerald, give way to a mix of earthly pleasures with worldly company. On these rich and happy occasions, often with the indefatigable Carlos Barrios or Ken Redpath there helping, John would say, "So what will we do today?" Well, Louise has given us the answer. There was 1 at 11 rather than 11 at 1. Although I think there have been occasions where there were 11 at 1. But in any case, ladies and gentlemen, please turn your eyes to the screen and take in this extraordinary compilation, which includes vision at the end of the video, that was given to us just over the weekend by Destination New South Wales. And I'm sure you'll be able to see just what that footage is. Thank you.
In my own case, what I'm endeavouring to do is to get the breath of the Australian, how he sort of behaves, the sort of rhythm that runs through a people to which in the end we might call the Australian. To arrive at this, I begin by sort of doodling. An unfortunate word in English that we've got no other equivalent for it. I let lines and colours move around and sort of splotch and dab. And I look at this, I turn the canvas up and around and about. And on the lookout for things that begin to mean something to me. I discover heads, animals, contours of country, the movement of one thing to another. I try to arrive at more of a sort of total thing. Australian art before, I feel, was interested in sort of arriving at the singular thing. I want my paintings to have lots of things in them. I don't care if they've got any sort of logical relationship to each other, but as long as there is a sort of feeling for the whole, that life is a big, rich plum, and I want to reveal that sort of big, rich plum with seed inside and sometimes rotten, you know, that sort of bursting ripeness, which I feel is rather sort of corresponding to the expansion of Australia at the moment. I feel that Australia is like a big, rich plum with sort of seeds of growth and seeds of destruction. It's rather an exciting, wonderful place to live in.
Some like Picasso's blue appearing best, others like the rose, la da da dee, la 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 da dee da la da, la 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 ha ha ha. Cooking is the transference from landscape to people in which we can share in the enjoyment of the things that are given to us from the earth.
Just a different type of sensual pleasure.
A different kind of understanding that we must always be thankful.
Tell me about your inspiration for colour, shapes and lines. Where does that all derive from?
Well, it's really, the colour factor is really to do with the characteristics that colour has itself. It's fundamentally a very simple idea, and all good ideas are, in their beginning, simple ideas. Yellow expands, blue recedes, browns have a melancholy, elegiac quality about them. Now, what I've emphasised here is not so much the look of the object. The object is there, but to try to give the feeling of the object, the feeling of the landscape, the feeling of the sun in the ceiling, you know, that sort of creative aspect of life. I'm interested in objects, extremely interested in objects, but think of forming rather than form. Like you have the flower, the seed part in dark earth. It picks itself up and it's green. It faces its environment. And then suddenly you've got a rose out of all that dirty part. That's astonishing. You know, I just feel kind of happy, kind of happy that it's working. I mean, I would never have thought that as I was being classically trained at Julian Aston's art school to do pictures that more or less had the tonal veracity of Velasquez and Frans Hals, that I would ever finish doing paintings like this. And I can understand being a slight disappointment to the school, but that's the way it is. See, look at this, isn't this really? See, we're playing a very good game there. See, look how it's becoming part of it. I mean, the way that's blending, it's so beautiful, just to give that draining effect.
At 83, John Olsen still gets excited by the creative process, especially when the subject is Lake Eyre.
Really gobsmacked with the sheer scale of it. And it comes to you that, yes, it is an inland sea. Just don't think it's just a lake. It's a huge expanse of water. And one can look to the horizon and the lake is still going. I mean, wow. And you're looking at something that has never changed and hopefully will never change. It's called the big wow factor.
I'll tell you what I can't wait for is for overseas people and all Australians to see Vivid, because the scale is so different. And there it is, spread like a huge pizza over Sydney Harbour, reflecting into the water in the harbour. God, I'm a lucky dog.
Well, everyone, I think we're the lucky dogs. So if over the next 3 weeks you do nothing else, get to Vivid, take in the absolutely stunning vision of the Opera House, illuminated on the sails by John Olsen's magnificent art. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, Amy Skinner and the Sydney Art Quartet have joined me back on the stage for the National Anthem, the words of which you can find in your program. So everyone, for those who are able, please be upstanding for the National Anthem. Please be seated. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as we near the end of this state memorial service to salute the life and times of John Olsen, please, any guests wishing to leave a message of condolence for John's family can do so by visiting the State Services page on the New South Wales Government website. May I just thank everyone, all of you, in this room, in the ante room out there, and online around Australia and around the world for joining us for this very special occasion. John's life does live on through his art, including over the next 3 weeks, as I said, on the sales of the Sydney Opera House. His legacy continues with his family, and the name Olsen is a dynasty. Thank you for joining us today for this celebration of life of a truly great Australian whose genius has touched us all. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today.